Hi, welcome everyone. Delighted you could join us this afternoon. My name is Amjad Hall. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. We're presenting the talk today with Michael Hardt, the Subversive Seventies. And I want to particularly thank Alberto Toscano for pulling this all together. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Today's talk is going to be moderated by Brenna Bhandar. Brenna's research and teaching broadly lie within the fields of property studies and legal theory, spanning the disciplines of property law, critical theory, colonial legal history, and critical race feminism. Her book, Colonial Lives of Property, Law, Land, and Racial Regimes of Ownership, was published in 2018 with Duke University Press and co-edited with Rafeef Ziadah, Revolutionary Feminism's Conversations on Collective Action and Radical Thought, was published in 2020 with Verso. Please join me in welcoming Brenna Bhandar.
Thanks, Sam. So just to elaborate on the land acknowledgement, I think when we acknowledge that we're on the unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations, it's to acknowledge that this land was not ceded through treaty, it was not sold, it was not given up. And it's to acknowledge really our status as uninvited occupiers. I know people say uninvited guests sometimes, but I haven't been invited by anybody to be here. And I think this land acknowledgement really means different things to different people. And I want to acknowledge that for me, and I think I can speak for our panel, that it signals a commitment to decolonization. And it's not some kind of lament for something that happened in the past. And in making that commitment to decolonization and a commitment to a fundamentally different distribution of land and resources, it's also incumbent upon us to speak out against colonial forms of land dispossession wherever they are happening. And I want to acknowledge the genocidal violence being inflicted on Gaza and also the severe intensification and the militarized land dispossession happening all over Palestine right now. So with that, I will begin my introduction to our wonderful panel, and I want to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. Michael Hardt is a professor of literature at Duke University. He is a prolific scholar, having published over 7 monographs and countless articles, interviews, pamphlets, and the like. Over the course of decades, Michael has produced groundbreaking work on revolution, transformations in labor, exploring the implications of immaterial labor for the production of value, contemporary forms of alienation, exploitation, and resistance, neo-imperial forms of globalization, as well as concepts of political love and solidarity. His work is indelibly linked to that of his longtime collaborator, teacher, and friend, Antonio Negri, who very sadly passed away yesterday. Michael began his collaboration with Tony through translating his book, The Savage Anomaly, and they would go on to write 4 books together, all of which made a massive contribution to how we understand contemporary struggles over sovereignty, democracy, property, collective organization, and many other aspects of contemporary political life and world-making. To say their work generated lively debate and dissension amongst different left intellectual communities would be an understatement. Those books include Empire, Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of Empire, Commonwealth, and Assembly. Today, we are here to mark the publication and celebrate the publication of Michael's new book, The Subversive Seventies, which couldn't be more timely in many ways. As many of us grapple with a sense of undefeated despair, shall we say. It's a good moment to gather and reflect on radical political thought and action. Now to Michael's interlocutors. Glen Coulthard is Yellowknives Dene and an associate professor in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program and the departments of political science at the University of British Columbia. He is the author of, as everyone here I'm sure knows, Redskin White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition, which won many accolades and book prizes. I won't mention them all here. He is also a co-founder of the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning, a decolonial indigenous land-based post-secondary program operating on his traditional territories in the Northwest Territories. Next, we will hear from Sharon Luk, who is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of the Geographies of Racialization at Simon Fraser University. Her first monograph, The Life of Paper, Letters into Poetics of Living Beyond Captivity, won major awards from the American Studies Association and the Modern Language Association. She has previously served as faculty or postdoctoral fellow at UCLA, Stanford University, and the University of Oregon. Her research has appeared in the journals Journal of American History, American Quarterly, the New Centennial Review, Souls, Environment and Planning D, and a forthcoming issue of Critical Ethnic Studies, although I think that's out. No. Anyway. And finally, we will hear from Alberto Toscano, who is professor in critical theory at the Department of Sociology, Goldsmiths, University of London, where he co-directs the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought. But he is also, and mainly, a term research associate professor at the Digital Democracy Institute School of Communication, SFU. Alberto recently published 2 books, one titled Late Fascism, which we will be launching here at the beginning of February, and the other book, Terms of Disorder, Keywords for an Interregnum, which is a collection of essays spanning the last 15 years. As the series editor of the Italian list for Calcutta-based publisher Siegel Books, Alberto's research is also concerned with the translation and reception of Italian literature, literary criticism, and critical theory. So I would first like to invite Michael to speak to us for a little while about the book, and then we will hear from Glen, Sharon, and Alberto, after which time we will open up the floor to questions and have a Q&A. So thank you once again, and please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Brenna. Especially thanks to Glen, Alberto, and Sharon for being here. This is exactly the kind of thing that I was hoping for with this book, not so much to talk myself or even what I'd written, but to hear what other people are working on and have to say about the 1970s in a variety of different countries. As Brenna said, this is the first book I wrote alone, like by myself in 30 years. And I've been writing with Tony Negri for this time. As Brenna mentioned, he died earlier today. And it might seem a weird thing to do something like this, although I think it's actually the best thing for me to do, to be with you and to talk about these kind of things. Yeah, I'm going to hold it together, absolutely. Yeah, let me give sort of an introduction to the way I'm thinking about this project and about the political movements or revolutionary movements of the 1970s. And then that's what I'm hoping for, having conversation and hearing about other people. That's what I'm most interested in. So the first hypothesis I have about the revolutionary movements of the 1970s is that the 70s are the beginning of our era. And what I mean by that, first, no disrespect to revolutionary movements of the 1960s. They were certainly transformative, but I feel like they were part of our recent past. Whereas I think the 70s are the beginning of our times. I could mean that in two ways. One which is maybe what less concerns me, which is that the forms of power that we face were developed in the 1970s. So you'd be familiar with thinking, say, about theories of neoliberalism that date them beginning of the 1970s, say, with 1973, with the coup in Chile, that could be a beginning. Or you could think of Reagan-Thatcher as a beginning, something like that. You could also think in terms of transformations of labor, that is, say, the destruction of the industrial working base and its political initiatives in the dominant countries through automation, through exportation of factories to elsewhere, et cetera. I think that part's easy to recognize, that the forms of power that were developed in the 1970s are still the ones that we're faced. I'm more interested in really the other side of the matter, which is that I think that the revolutionary movements of the 70s identified and worked on the political problems that are still our political problems. And that's what I need to flesh out for you in a minute to try to convince you of that. And this notion of political problems interests me as a criterion. I was struck by a line in Louis Althusser's essay in Reading Capital where he says something like, there's nothing more difficult and takes longer to solve than a false political problem. And so part of the job, I think, of political philosophy, but also of political movements, is to cast aside false political problems and to identify real ones. And so that's what I'm trying to say, is that these movements identified, the problems that we face and in some ways experimented with solutions to them. And in doing this, I guess you could say, in the way I'm presenting it, it could sound like, and I think this is partly true, that these revolutionary movements of the 1970s in various countries developed what one might think of, say, the seeds of more recent political organizing and activism. Like, think, for instance, how anti-nuclear movements, like the one at Seabrook, New Hampshire, developed affinity groups as an organizing tactic with consensus decision-making, something that we've then seen in movements in North America, certainly, and elsewhere. Further on, or rather the strategies of encampments. I'm thinking in the 1970s of, like, there was a large decade-long encampment in France in Larzac to prevent the expansion of a military base, or even the more dramatic one for much longer even in Japan to prevent the construction of what's now the Tokyo airport at Narita. That these encampments and the kinds of politics that go together in encampments could easily seem like, in the US context, this encampment around Cop City outside of Atlanta, which you might have heard about, or in France, these soulèvements de la terre, long-standing encampments that are foreign politics. Okay, in that sense, I was just trying to give you some examples, the ways that you could see the kind of beginnings of our organizational tactics and strategies there. I'm more interested actually here, though, in the opposite one again, which is that not so much in which we have gone and developed on what's happened in the 70s, but rather the ways in which the 70s were really ahead of us, and that we have something to learn by recuperating the characteristics and maybe even organizational forms of the 1970s. Okay, a second hypothesis, if the first hypothesis was that the 70s are really the beginning of our era, and so therefore have a relevance to us, what's going on with them. A second hypothesis, maybe a more obvious one, is that there's a kind of theorizing and formation of concepts even that goes on collectively in movements. What I mean by this is it's not as if there's some division of labor where intellectuals think and activists act. Instead, there's a kind of thinking and theoretical production that goes on collectively in social and political movements, sometimes in a different register, sometimes with different terminologies, but that's partly what I'm trying to read and recuperate. In fact, when I reflect on it, sorry if I got Tony on the brain today. In some ways, that's what Tony and I were trying to do all along in these books, I think, is to try to interpret the problems that are being recognized and posed in the contemporary movements. Okay, I think that's maybe an easy thing to and that they produce concepts. That's what I'm trying to get at. And maybe in a minute I'll talk about some of those concepts, like what I'm calling multiplicity and articulation. I think I'll have time for that. Okay, one last introductory thing, or probably another introductory thing before this, yes, which is that I do feel like when talking about revolutionary movements in the 1970s, there has to be some comparison with the 60s, because at least I perceive in a general cultural imaginary, it's assumed that the 60s was the last revolutionary movement and the last revolutionary moment, globally, and that the 70s instead was a movement of decay or decline of revolutionary movements. And I think that's, you know, I want to argue against that in a variety of ways. One way I could just bring up is this notion that in the 70s everything fell apart, like with in a kind of fragmentation of the movements, with a supposed unity in the 1960s. Often this supposed unity in the 1960s is under the leadership, assumed leadership of the industrial working class, you know, as if the industrial working class could represent the entire proletariat or represent all of the struggles. And so quite clearly in the 1970s, early 1970s were an extraordinary moment of industrial worker militancy in North America, in many parts of Europe, in Argentina. But by the mid-1970s, like I said, there was a conscious project on part of management, on part of capital and other forces to destroy the basis of the industrial working class. In Italy, this was called, they used the phrase, maybe it fits everywhere else too, which is the end of the centrality of the industrial worker. You know, the end of that notion that the industrial worker could represent. And that's generally viewed, I would say, in our cultural memory as a tragedy. You know, that decline of that political role of the industrial working class. I would like to view it instead not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. And this supposed fragmentation is actually an extremely positive political development. Because what was assumed to have caused that fragmentation were feminist groups that refused to work under the leadership of the industrial working class, anti-racist movements that too were either excluded or subordinated within the industrial working class, gay and lesbian movements that were similarly outside of it. So that what looked as fragmentation, or was often cast as fragmentation, I would say is a development of a multiplicity of struggles that are all relatively autonomous, which pose, I would say, the political problem of articulation, I guess, which I'll talk about in a minute. Like how, but just in simple terms, what I mean is, instead of yearning for some new unity, as if there could be some new revolutionary subject that could subsume and lead all the forces of liberation, rather having a field of multiple struggles for liberation that are not simply separate, you know, fragmented in that sense, but nonetheless are able to articulate one with the other. And I think that that's something actually that I know that will come up as part of the discussion. One last introductory point, which maybe just, which is this, which I think one way in which, like I said earlier, there's some ways in which the 70s were ahead of us. And one summary way, it seems to me, is in terms of the audacity of the vision of the movements, like particularly around the question of liberation. I think it was assumed in each of these various movements that I was just talking about, that liberation was not only a distant goal, but was a real possibility. So worker liberation, feminist liberation, gay liberation, black liberation, indigenous liberation. I mean, I think that notion of liberation seems to me, and I'd be happy to be told I'm wrong about this, seems to me has been downgraded in the contemporary, like our ambitions have been downgraded. You know, say from feminist liberation to gender equality, from gay liberation to marriage equality. I'm sorry, I got to turn this off because, as you can imagine, everyone who's seen that Tony has died wants to call me, which I appreciate and is lovely, but it should has to wait for later. Right, or from black liberation to Black Lives Matter, you know, extremely important goal. Survival is an important goal, but it seems to me it's different than liberation. So the one thing in North America, which I would, and primarily North America, which I maybe as a caveat, or if I were arguing with myself, which I do often, I would contest myself and say, well, no, Michael, it's actually around discourses about abolition that today is at least implied the possibility of liberation. You know, so questions about liberation in a variety of sense, not just questions about the prison or questions about the police, but the abolition of borders, feminist arguments for the abolition of the family, queer abolitions for the abolition of the gender binary. In a number of ways, I think that they give at least open a space. There, what I would say. I would say that the abolition discourses, but you might say I'm wrong, don't yet have the imagination of a positive project of liberation, but open a space where liberation is possible. That's where I would say. In any case, despite my own arguments with myself, at least you could understand what I mean about the ambitions, the height of the ambitions. That's what I was calling the audacity of the movements. And in some ways, you know, what I realize I'm arguing against is even protagonists from the 1970s. Like, I'm not a protagonist from the 1970s. I was alive, but I was not politicized as a teenager. And so I wasn't a participant, but many participants will say things like, oh, we were so naive to believe that we could do X or Y. And I think that's wrong. I think that actually a struggle for liberation is possible for today, was possible then. I don't mean that we're on the verge of revolution and next week we're gonna somehow free ourselves from the current struggles, but I still think it's extremely important to pose liberation as a goal and to struggle for it and to recognize its real possibility. There you go. Good. I have time for one. There are many. So in my book, and partly what I was trying to say at the outset, a task I set for myself, a totally impossible one, to try to talk about revolutionary movements that inspire me, and I think that relate to today. That's one criterion, but in as many countries as possible. And it's an impossible task. You know, like the book invites people to say, oh, but Michael, why didn't you talk about X? And that's exactly what I want. I mean, that's in fact what I'm hoping for. But nonetheless, I wanted to talk about a couple concepts. Well, okay, one else, I mean, there's one that's important to me, but I think I should just name it instead of time, which is a number of struggles for revolutionary democracy, like conceived this way. I'm thinking, like, I partly started thinking about this in the anti-colonial struggles in the Portuguese colonies in Africa and Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, in which they theorized revolutionary democracy as a kind of, you know, certainly they didn't want a democratic transition to somehow arrive at a European-style democratic system. They wanted to reinvent democracy from the ground up. And in fact, one of the things that I found lines that I found so charming among the anti-colonial revolutionaries, this is in Guinea-Bissau, and I'm thinking actually of Amilcar Cabral, the best known leader in Guinea-Bissau, who was saying that they actually had the opportunity in the Portuguese colonies that those in the French and British colonies didn't have, because in the French and British colonies, there were all kinds of governmental structures and legal structures that were in a sense left behind, and with the independence were recuperated and changed, but nonetheless. So what they said is in the Portuguese colonies, the Portuguese left no furniture laying about. And I thought it was a lovely way of saying, like, that we have the possibility of inventing something new, and so I think this notion of reinventing democracy, like not abandoning the concept because what we've been sold as democracy is something, you know, that really isn't democracy, but rather reinterpreting the concept and making it anew. You know, sometimes under the notion of popular power, I would say in Chile, this is a lot was going on during those 3 years. In the Portuguese revolutionary experience, the same thing. And in all of these revolutionary struggles, even when it wasn't named, I think the invention of a new democracy. Okay, I said more about that than I wanted. So the other thing I wanted to pose, and this go into a little bit more, a few more minutes about, is what I'm calling the concept of multiplicity, and especially the notion of articulation. And for me, this starts, you know, at least conceptually, thinking from the perspective of, or with certain wisdom from, socialist feminist movements in North America and Britain that theorized capitalist patriarchy. And theorizing capitalist patriarchy, part of the basis of understanding that concept was that neither of those two structures of power was prior over the other. Like, it's not that capital was prior and this is actually what the feminists were struggling against with their comrades in the socialist movement, that capitalism is prior, and of course we have a woman question. We have patriarchy is also like a secondary problem. But neither did they want to go along with what, at least in the US context, was an argument of radical feminists at the time, which was that patriarchy was primary. After all, it's existed for 2,000 and such years, and capital's only recent. Instead, they said the two structures of power are relatively autonomous. One doesn't create the other, but there can be no priority between the two. They have to be understood, like they said, on equal footing. I object a little bit to the implication of measure, as if we could measure, like, I don't know, how much suffering did capital cause, 49, and how much suffering did did patriarchy cause, I don't know, 48. I think that measure is not the question. In fact, I think it's a strategic political decision to refuse the priority between them. Okay, but the real important thing, though, is on the other side, and from which these socialist feminists were thinking, which is, what is the relationship between a feminist struggle and an anti-capitalist struggle? And there can only be an articulation if the two are recognized as relatively autonomous and without priority between them. And so that gets, in a variety of other groups, often on feminist terrain. In the 1970s, this gets developed with other movements, like, for instance, many of you probably know the famous Combahee River Collective statement in 1977, written by Black Feminist Collective. And there they expand what I've been talking about. They say, I'm trying to remember the sentence exactly, it's something like, we came together as an anti-racist and a feminist group. But in the course of our deliberations, we recognized we were also anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-heteronormative. So it's a kind of political education that allows for the recognition of an articulation among struggles without priority among them. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And that's something that seems to me to have great relevance for today. We could talk about that later. I guess, okay, I say the obvious, it is an argument against what remains in certain circles as a class first perspective. Like, other struggles are important, but class is primary, et cetera. And I guess what I'm arguing for is and that I'm finding in these struggles in the 1970s is, like I said, a possibility of articulation, and the articulation only is possible with a refusal of priority among struggles. Let me give just one other slightly shifted example of what I consider the same concept, and then I'll stop. I think I'm okay with time. Are you can, okay. Alberto's too, okay. Which is, in terms of what I think of as racial multiplicities, which I think functions along the same lines. So, again, I'll give a US example, and I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but it comes quickly to mind, which is at San Francisco State College, this is in 1968, was formed a group called the Third World Liberation Front, and they were a student group making demands on the administration for, in terms of admissions and in terms of curriculum, like admitting more students of color and changing the curriculum towards creating ethnic studies program, Black studies program, et cetera. What interests me in part is that this Third World Liberation Front was composed of 5 different student groups: the Black Student Union, the Chinese student group, the Filipino student group, the Mexican student group, and the Latin American student group. And if this were, in some ways, I would say by the term third world, which in retrospect seems a little weird, they're all USers, but I think the notion of third world allowed them to recognize these diverse racializations without priority among them. Like, it wouldn't have functioned, it seems to me, as an articulation of a group if you had said, well, okay, the Black Student Union is really the leader of this, and the others are somehow junior partners. Instead, I think, and I would say that Third World functioned in the early 70s. In the later 70s, I think, in the US context, people of color replaced that term in some ways. Third World functioned like the Third World Women's Alliance, which was formed in New York more or less in these same years, as a recognition of a possible articulation among diverse racializations. You understand what I mean? One last example about this, which is slightly different, but I think has a similar principle, which is in the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And I'm thinking here primarily of a testimony that Steve Biko, the most recognized leader of the Black consciousness movement that he gave to these apartheid judges who called him in. He wasn't actually on trial. Other members of SASO, the student group, were on trial. But they called him in to explain what is Black consciousness, these white apartheid judges, which is a very bizarre situation. But he tried for a number of days to do this. Before then, he was killed in prison a couple weeks later. But nonetheless, so he starts by saying, look, there is no such thing as a Black policeman. If you're a policeman, you're not Black, regardless of your skin color. Instead, he said Black is really a political concept. And so that it's not only that Black South Africans are Black, but also members of the South Asian community, members of the so-called colored community, all except whites, can be Black if they are part of the struggle. So Black became a political concept that allowed for, in the same way, a kind of racial multiplicity that allowed for an articulation among diverse racializations within the struggle, if that makes sense to you. So that's what so I just was trying there to give an example of what I mean by multiplicity and articulation and how it worked in certain contexts then, which I would say, maybe you're not directly applicable to today, although, okay, anyway, we could talk about that. Or, okay, maybe I should say one thing about it first, because since I'm going to stop after this, which is just this. I would say that, just another thing I might be wrong about. A lot of things I say might be wrong, but it seems to me that in all the major struggles today, there is expressed a desire for this kind of articulation. So that in Black Lives Matter protests in the George Floyd wave, the most recent one in the US, at every demonstration, of course, it's against white supremacy, but it's also, at the demonstration we say we're an anti-capitalist movement, and we're a feminist movement, and we're affirming Black trans lives. So that I would say, I'm not sure that the articulation actually takes place, but there's a desire for it too. I think this happens in union organizing today too, that there's a similar kind of expression of a desire for an articulation among struggles. And I think that desire is super important. I mean, political desires don't immediately translate into reality, but they are nonetheless an extremely important building block. Okay, here's the last thing, which comes from a close friend of mine who read the manuscript and who was someone who was a participant in the era, somewhat older than me. So he said, look, Michael, all this is very inspiring and everything, but we lost. Like all of these movements you're talking about, we lost. And so, it made me think a little bit because I do want to win, don't get me wrong. So it's not, here's one way of dealing with it I thought was useful as a starting point for me. This is a sentence from Robin Kelley's book, Freedom Dreams. Yeah, sorry, I almost lost it. Freedom Dreams. So Robin Kelley says, too many focus on whether a movement succeeds rather than the quality of its vision. Like that might be a good start. Like I'm okay with that. Like, so say when we study these movements, you shouldn't, he says, I'm saying, you shouldn't ask, the first question shouldn't be, did it succeed or fail? But what is the quality of its vision? And that is what, the idea is that that's what continues. I would put it somewhat differently, but maybe it's really the same thing, which is I want to make a distinction between failure and defeat. Actually, Alberto and I have already had this discussion, but it's not unuseful, for me at least. You see, I would say that a movement failed. To say that a movement fails means that the failure was caused by an internal flaw. And so it might be useful to study it, and it might even be useful to study why it failed, but nonetheless, a failed movement is somehow end of the line. Whereas I would say a defeat is the result of an external superior force. And so a movement that's defeated really continues on, or rather, maybe it's something else. Maybe it provides a kind of platform from which we could start again. So in other words, regarding these movements as defeats, as being defeated by superior external forces, that allows us to regard them not as something consigned to the past, but something as still potentially present that we can make use of and move forward. Good. I'm going to stop. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm gonna sit. I've got a bad knee. Thank you, Michael, for writing this book, and I'm very sorry about your friend. So I'm just gonna summarize what I think this book has to offer, particularly me, who's been trying to write a book for the last 6 or 7 years, and was this book really, or Michael's book really jarred something loose in 2 ways. The first is historical. I was stuck. I'm writing a book on the cross-pollinations of movements and that kind of influenced Red Power in Canada in the 1970s. But I was stuck in this Global 68 sort of moment, and it just didn't quite fit because that's when Red Power officially kind of started. But most of its interventions occurred through the 70s into the early 1980s. So there was just something that was didn't quite fit, which the Subversive Seventies jarred loose for me. So that's one thing. The second was my role as a trained political theorist. I didn't know. I was just accumulating all these stories, and I was masquerading as a historian, and I'm not a historian, but I didn't have I didn't feel that I had a voice in this narrative, which your book also kind of illuminated for me. And this is the interpretation or the reinterpretation of concepts that are sometimes explicit but sometimes implicit in movements themselves, and that's the role of the type of theorizing that you do. So that was also very important for me because I was just floundering. I didn't know where my voice was or what I had to offer other than recounting these types of stories. So I'll just talk about the 70s and then the kind of theorizing that emerges from it. So the 70s in Canada was a very important time. The consolidation of power and its subjectifying effects came into play more than previous generations. So they have the land struggle, for instance, was attempted to be contained through the comprehensive land claims process, which over time was integrating Indigenous people and lands into the market economy while having a subjectifying effect or interpolative effect for the participants in that process. But meanwhile, also simultaneously, when that process didn't take hold, the repressive state apparatus through police violence and whatnot came cracking down really heavily. So that started in 1973. You have a consolidation of the urban population, so a migration from reserve-based communities into the cities, which creates kind of an alternate base for Red Power activism within the urban context. Importantly, super crucially, you have the Arab-Israeli War in 1973, which creates the oil crisis of the same period and an extra push for extractivism and extractive industries, particularly in the north, which is where I'm part of the case studies that I examine with my own people, the Dene. So you have oil and gas become a national interest or a domestication of extractivism because of hostile, unsafe climate of investment elsewhere. So you have this, and then the solidarity between Palestinians and native groups like consolidate during that period. So all of this I started to see as like a really important period of time, even though it also inaugurates a period of defeat, it's where the liberation struggle amongst indigenous peoples gets co-opted into instruments of neo-colonial governmentality. So that's that part. The second aspect that I found super crucial with the book was, again, this theoretical voice that the text provided. So as somebody like where my voice was interpreting these concepts which were either explicit or implicit in these movements, which Michael does very well through, particularly through the Combahee Collective and Stuart Hall, and by throwing himself into the literatures of the day, of the era. Where my approach differs, I think, and this is, and I brought this up in Toronto, is by not only treating the movements as articulating various concepts, but they're actually quite well versed in theoretical traditions of their time. And in particular, I would argue that various concepts taken from Maoism are particularly salient during this time. So where you get at the multiplicity of struggles through Hall's notion of articulation, or Young's theorization of capitalist patriarchy, I think that a lot of folks during the time, including the Combahee Collective, are working on the Maoist kind of notion of contradiction. So contradiction in the Maoists, or in the interpretation of Mao, is that contradictions, of course, are an essence, or are essential to the thing, and they make up its essence. So as soon as the contradiction goes away, the thing itself is fundamentally changed. There are multiple contradictions which inform each other and are related to each other. But the important point, I think, and this is for Red Power folks and in particular Black Power folks during the time, is that the contradictions change, or can change, in terms of primary or secondary. So in some cases, race or racial contradictions or oppression might be primary, and the capital relation is secondary. Colonial relations might be primary, and the capital relation might be secondary. So this is the way in, and this is like where I distinguish my work from your work. Is the role that that the practitioners or theorist practitioners within the movements are using, and the kind of the Maoist concepts, which I think is effaced in Hall by his turn towards Euro-communists like Althusser or whatever. So this is all to say that your book was profoundly illuminating, and quite frustrating, in the sense that I've had to distinguish this work that I've been kind of compiling over the almost a decade now, from the work that you've published in this in the 70s. And it's just some stupid little Maoist thing that I have to distinguish my own intellectual production from your own. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you to the organizers of this event for this occasion together, which is always really nice. To Alberto for inviting me, to my fellow participants, and everyone here for the conversation that aims to celebrate people's struggles in the spirit of Michael Hardt's new book, The Subversive Seventies. I started reading this book around the time that my kindergarten child had just brought home his first school progress report. And one of the things they're working on is phonetic reading, so sensing words. And I remember one of the comments on the assessment encouraging me to keep helping him developing the skills of stretching the sounds so that he can begin hearing and incorporating more letters into his reading and writing practice. And I mention this because I find it perhaps a useful metaphor for one of the generative things that I find Michael's book to be doing, which is in essence asking us to stretch our sense of space-time in this decade that is so commonly collapsed or enunciated as identical with the insurgencies of the prior or the counterinsurgencies of the one following. So for me, then, the opportunity that Hardt invites us into to pause and engage our senses in the particularities of the 70s, as I kept reading, actually became less about making a case for the significance of this decade and more a provocation to consider the social reproduction of political imagination and the grounds of political organizing. So for my time today, I'm just going to focus on this theme of social reproduction and see if we can keep stretching the terrain that Hardt lays out, and particularly as they overlap in the chapters on anti-racism, feminisms, liberation theology, and what he calls the end of mediation. In his intro, Michael argues that one reason for the common elision of the movements of the 70s has to do with the who. In other words, a certain carelessness when it comes to remembering and appreciating social movements led by communities who define, in our negative exclusions, the boundaries of the normative human. It is in this sense, then, that my own work in thinking about this period has been most concerned with the relationships of racial capitalism to genocide on the one hand, and on the other with understanding social struggles through the lens of contending ways of life, which are differences in kind, not only in quality, which Michael touches on in his discussions of various multiplicities, which we heard about. This latter perspective demanding that we think from entirely different referential universes, as I think Glenn just mentioned. So on the most immediate level regarding social reproduction, then, I've been interested in the contradictions of intimate and public life amongst communities under the dense pressures of capitalist genocide, and thus whose community development practices can be critical to sustaining all of life on Earth. In this context, there are never clear answers or even analytics to address the practical tensions between what organizing demands and what daily care for children and elders demands. And this is distinctively pronounced in the 70s, a decade in which movement organizers and revolutionaries were starting to have their own children and even grandchildren. The now well-worn contention that the personal is political played out in specific ways amongst communities targeted for racialized war and confinement. And I'll share just examples from two different contexts to think about this. First, children born in Japanese internment camps were by the 70s of child-rearing age and their parents positioned to be grandparents. Filmmaker Omiko Omori opens her 1999 documentary Rabbit in the Moon with the reflection that she, along with her family, had repressed all memory and discussion of their camp experiences until one day a friend had asked her, "Why have you not had kids?" And becoming conscious of the implicit instinct she had had her whole life not to bring children into this world led her down the rabbit hole of making meaning of the camps. The dominance of Japanese American liberals empowered by the state as mediators came to obscure the diversity of political leanings and responses within the Nikkei community and mainstream the redress movement to equate it in the US with the Civil Liberties Act of '88 that came with a presidential apology and $20,000 compensation. What I'm trying to get to, though, is that in the 70s, the Sansei community, or the children and grandchildren of camp survivors, served as a different kind of mediating force, directly processing the historical traumas their family were only but beginning to acknowledge in the intimacies of home through the sieves of the mass displacements they were witnessing as a result of urban redevelopment, as well as calls for reparations from Black and Native communities for the US government's genocidal activities. This example then complements Hardt's attention to third world struggle and highlights how at the broken crossroads of representation and reproduction, discussed as the end of mediation, and also delimits in a different way the very discourses of trauma, How at this interstice, we are not simply talking about the historical conjuncture of multiple struggles, but fundamentally a different praxis of formulating concepts and relations between self and other in the political labor to renew what we might understand as ethnic heritage and its embodiment. A second set of examples relates to thinking about the intensified dynamics between above ground and underground activities that Michael discusses amongst groups such as the Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, SDS, and the Weather Underground. Again, born in 1979 myself, in my own peer groups and political cohorts, I've had the privilege of getting to know some of the children of this era's radical and revolutionary actors, many of whom, as Michael points out, were imprisoned or exiled into the 70s for their subversive activities. One difficult contradiction that some in the public eye, such as Chesa Boudin, have talked openly about, but many others can't or choose not to, is what it's like as a child and also as adults to pay the price of their parents' revolutionary commitments. Perhaps the most explicit example of this is Assata Shakur's autobiographical storytelling of her own experiences of conception, pregnancy, childbirth, and maternal alienation while a political prisoner in the 70s. What she calls the guilt and sorrow in her chest during prison visits of her then 4-year-old daughter, who confronts her in tears, screaming, "You are not my mother and I hate you." These exchanges cause Assata herself to cry until she vomits when she returns to her cell, and at least as she tells the story, is what convinces her that she must escape. In another example, Dolores Huerta, whom we might consider a more veteran activist by the 70s, recently gave a radio interview with Latino USA in which she clearly acknowledged that raising her 11 children was simply never a priority in her view, of what she understood as her real life's work with the UFW. And I mention this certainly not to judge the impossible choices of what Joy James calls the captive maternal, or to idealize child rearing, and all of this for a brief flicker acknowledged during the pandemic. But more simply to point out the pervasiveness then, and to some extent still now, of a sacrificial logic animating the notion of struggle that, particular to women and children who make up the world's majority, translates into the necessity of self-sacrifice for the cause. Michael's attention to the interventions of liberation theology, as well as Black and queer and Italian feminisms then, can be understood as directly addressing the crises of genocide and social reproduction in terms of how we care for one another in the struggle as constitutive of struggle, which foundationally changes the very nature of the how, the why, and the what we are struggling for. My own concerns on this point have to do with the significance of the trajectory in the 70s to pose these problems of care in direct connection to the social movements and power relations. And Glen points out, and I read this also from Colleen Lai, that, for instance, the Combahee Collective statement is a direct interpretation of Maoism theory of contradiction. So similar to how Michael ended his comments, I am invested in reviving these grounds in contradistinction from the current hegemony of self-care discourses, even within progressive movements, as therapeutic, atomized, and in the service of preserving a bourgeois self, both in practice and in concept. Let's see. Sorry. I'll bring this to a somewhat abrupt conclusion by just raising a couple points about social reproduction at this latter scale of abstraction, at the level of concept. First, I mentioned at the top that it might be generative to view social movements at this time as problematizing the foundations of human being, and attendant on that, the concept and relations of being as such, akin to grounded normativities, to borrow from Glen's work. So even in the late 60s, for instance, the language of universal man was still quite prevalent in social movement discourse, although I'd argue that we have to understand its signification through the lens of contradiction as people are actively working through the question. In the 70s, though, what I surmise is the gestalt of the momentum of Black arts, as well as the productive problem of third world and post-colonial aesthetics through the long 20th century, contributed to clear articulations of both race and nation as analytical and embodied forms whose dimensions could give us alternative concepts of the human as such, the very notion of the human. And I'll share just a couple of easy examples in the US context, which is the context I come from, to illustrate the point. The first is James Baldwin's open letter to my sister Angela Davis, dated November 70 and originally published in January 71, in which he writes, quote, "The enormous revolution in Black consciousness which has occurred in your generation, my dear sister, means the beginning or the end of America. Some of us, white and Black, know how great a price has already been paid to bring into existence a new consciousness, a new people, an unprecedented nation." Likewise, Father Daniel Berrigan's elaboration of the problem of whiteness in his letter to the Weathermen, initiated as a voice recording from underground in 70 and published in 1971, also frames racial being and anti-racism ultimately as an ontological transformation in historical terms. He begins that letter, quote, "The threat is a very simple one. We are guilty of making connections. We urge others to explore new ways of getting connected, of getting married, of educating children, of sharing goods and skills, of being religious, of being human, of resisting, and I am guilty of making connections with you." And I'll end with just this final example, since it may be an obvious one to some of you. By the 70s, Sylvia Wynter was already well on her way to explaining the regime of the human inaugurated by modern thought and facilitating the genocides of racial capitalism and colonialism. While much of this work wasn't published until the 80s, her work published in the 70s presciently explained to other movement activists how unproblematized appropriations of dominant regimes of the human in burgeoning ethnic studies and nation-based movements would ultimately reproduce the problems of man we remain in struggle to abolish. In this vein, she had suggested that an analytic of the social was more precise than that of the ethnic, and it could be added to the political. And so I'll end here on the problem of the human, the crisis of it, and the question of whether and how socialities alive in the 70s might be reinvented today. Thank you.
Do you need to keep time, or you?
I think I'll be okay, hopefully. Okay, well, it's great to be here and great to be able to celebrate Michael's phenomenal work. I was lucky enough to read Michael's book in manuscript, which then led me to send him a gargantuanly long email, which I hope he doesn't resent. It's not the kind of thing that it was mostly just full of some of the praise that we've already been hearing. But I had 7,000 ideas because it's an immensely rich book that takes us from popular power in Chile to the Gwangju Commune in Korea, from readings of the fabulous film Born in Flames to the Narita airport struggle. And it also enjoins us to, in a sense, in a kind of revolutionary, build-your-own-adventure sort of way, add extra chapters of our own devising, which is a little bit what I wanted to do very, very shortly here, because I've been thinking quite a bit recently, not just about the horrors that we're witnessing, but about the ease with which we forget, or our amnesia about the impact and sometimes maybe subterranean impact, but ongoing impact of Palestinian revolutionary movements and Palestinian revolutionary thought on the global phenomena of revolt and revolution and the visions, right? The quality of vision that Michael was talking about. And I wanted to really, this is an excuse to talk about this one moment and this one artifact from the early 1970s, which I discovered recently thanks first to a wonderful article published by Robin Kelly, who Glenn already cited in the Journal of Palestine Studies in 2019, discussing an exhibition that had been put together by Greg Thomas at the Abu Jihad Museum for Prisoner Movement Affairs in Al-Quds University, Abu Dis, a few years ago, I think in 2018, an exhibition under the title George Jackson and the Son of Palestine. And the reason for this was that shortly after the assassination of George Jackson, whose repercussions, planetary repercussions, were, at the scale of the, to now, for us, maybe more familiar Free Angela Davis movement, but manifested itself, not least, for instance, in seeding a lot of the thinking of early prison abolition movements in France via the group that Foucault was involved in, that was really a prisoner-led group, and all sorts of other scenarios, right? So shortly after Jackson was assassinated, his possessions in his cell were taken to family, comrades, etc. And among them were poems that were soon thereafter published in a memorial to George Jackson in the Black Panther paper. Now, these poems were by George Jackson and were not by George Jackson. He had copied them, not in full, but they were poems by a Palestinian poet, Sami al-Qassem. The Panthers didn't know, but had they, as they then turned to the 99, I believe, books in George Jackson's cell, which were also a revolutionary library for the other inmates, they would have found a volume which you can see in the next slide, Enemy of the Sun, volume of Palestinian poetry that had been published by a Black Radical press and was one of the few books of literature, alongside the poetry of June Jordan, I believe, in the possession of George Jackson, which mostly contained many of the Maoist texts that Glen was talking about. In particular, you can see in passages as the following. This is a full poem. This is actually the Samuel Qassem poem. But the part of, obviously if he'd copied the bits about Mahmoud Darwish, it would have been a bit of a giveaway, but he did not. And so they thought this was of his own devising, right? You may take the last strip of my land, feed my youth to prison cells. You may plunder my heritage. You may burn my books, my poems, or feed my flesh to the dogs. You may spread a web of terror on the roofs of my village, O enemy of the sun, but I shall not compromise, and to the last pulse in my veins I shall resist. And you can see why those were lines that were not devised, but they were written and lived by George Jackson and others. And it's very nice what Greg Thomas, who curated this exhibition, says, and I think for me it was such a moment of really thinking also at the level of poetics and aesthetics, what the multiplicity and articulation that Michael lays out so wonderfully in his book, and which he just mentioned, can mean, right? This too, right, is a form of multiplicity articulation. And Greg Thomas calls it very nicely a poetic mistake of radical kinship. If we could only have more of those, we'd be in a better place, probably. And what Robin Kelly draws from it, I think, is extremely important when he says that these forms of solidarity, which are the forms of solidarity that, again, you can trace through the chapters of Michael's books, the circulation of solidarities, of concepts, of methods, of techniques, and so on, are not to be thought of as analogies of victimhood, right? That is not what either George Jackson was thinking about, nor what the Palestinian revolutionaries who in the 1970s were extremely adamant that their struggle could only be a planetary struggle, without which it was both a narrow nationalist struggle and inevitably not just defeated but failing one, to use the categories from before. And Robin Kelly's phrase, I think, in this essay, From the River to the Sea to Every Mountaintop, Solidarity as World Making, I think is extremely important. He says it is not the condition of captivity that is the basis of solidarity, but the critique of captivity from a place of confinement, the shared dreams of liberation, right? The shared quality of vision, to quote Michael. The shared, and the mobilizing and planning to fulfill that dream, right? And we should probably also not forget the mobilizing and the planning as well as the dreaming. This is world making, Kelly says. Solidarity, in other words, is more than short-term alliances or coalitions, but a sort of prefigurative politics that demands of us a deeper transformation of society and our relationship to one another. And the other day, speaking of coalitions, and I just thought I'd mention it because it struck me as quite an insight. Ruthie Gilmore mentioned a comrade of hers who had this one line about coalitions that said, if there's nobody in it that you don't like, then you're not in a coalition. So you should remember that. You're just with your mates, right? So I think we should also remember, and I just, to bring this more to a close, but we should also really remember and I wanted to stress this, even though Michael's book could also be a coffee table book of images, or a film festival, or that, he does talk about also, for instance, in terms of Born in Flames and other works, the massive role that poetics and aesthetics had in this multiplicity and this articulation. The way that, for instance, Palestine was present in the posters of the Italian far left. bosses, you bastards, will hijack you. The Wandering Arab. These are the kind of posters produced, in fact, in the Potato Pedaio, in Tony's and his comrades' newspapers from the 1970s, and in film, and especially in film produced by Palestinians themselves, sometimes in collaboration with the film groups of far-left or communist parties in Europe and elsewhere. And I think part of this poetics and aesthetics has to do with this one line that in the document of the PFLP, the Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine, where they write quite strikingly, right? How can weak peoples face imperialist technological superiority, right? The kind of question of the 70s, and perhaps still very much one of the questions we're dealing with, right? What does it mean to struggle? What does revolution mean when the material, where this is not, open conventional warfare, right? When this is something else, and when in fact subjectivity and movements and people's liberation and people's war and coalition and all of those concepts are generated, all sorts of scales, sometimes very intimate, sometimes much more planned and organized, to think through this predicament. This was the predicament in which philosophers inspired by the Palestinian struggle, like Gilles Deleuze, writing in 1978, writes the following, and I just wanted to quote this because it's then, but it's also now. They have never been given any other chance than to surrender unconditionally. They have been offered only death. In the war that opposes them, Palestinians to Israel, Israel's actions are considered legitimate reprisals, even if they appear disproportionate, while those of the Palestinians are treated exclusively as terrorist crimes. And an Arab death has neither the same value nor the same weight as an Israeli death. We find ourselves, and I was really struck by this passage because entire books are now written about this, but I think Deleuze had an insight which people don't link to his philosophy, but was really coming from Palestine, coming from his friend, the poet and PLO activist Elias Sambar. We find ourselves in a situation analogous to that of the Spanish Civil War, when Spain served as a laboratory and experimentation for a still more terrible future. These are the lines almost identical in Gustavo Petro's speech at COP28, incidentally. Today, the state of Israel leads the experimentation. It is establishing a model of repression that will be converted for other countries, adapted by other countries. And I think the effort to think what are the movements and the solidarities that are not mirrors, right? They're not the inverse mirrors of this horrific form of experimentation, right? And lastly, I wanted to just mention a line that really struck me. I was thinking, one of the themes in Michael's book, which is in some sense for some the theme, but I think of the 70s, but which he rightly engages in a complex but also very nuanced detour around, right? The question of violence, the question of armed struggle, and so on. I was really struck reading Jean Genet's book, The Prisoner of Love, a text which is about his relationship to the Panthers as much as it is about his time in the camps, Palestinian camps with the Fedayeen. And he has this line which I thought was really striking, where he says, "The world can be changed by other means and the sort of wars in which people die. Power may be at the end of a gun, but sometimes it's also at the end of the shadow or the image of a gun." And I thought, it reminded me of just how much those shadows or those images are part of the history of the 70s, and also perhaps what can either be fetishized or can also lead us to maybe misunderstand the possibilities, the hopes, and the experimentation that Michael has gotten us to listen to, right? To develop a sensibility for, which is so powerful. So thanking Michael again for having brought us here, and hopefully we can open it up for conversation. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those really stimulating set of commentaries on Michael's book. Now, I think we'll just open it up to the audience at this point, and you can ask questions of Michael or any of the panelists, and we'll have a conversation. So I think I can probably just walk around with a microphone. Yeah? Oh, wow. Okay, great. Okay. Yeah. There's a question over here. Sure.
It's not. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic talk. Michael, at the beginning of your talk, when you were, well, not at the very beginning, at some point you said, we cannot really talk about 70s without somehow comparing it with the 60s movement, as the 60s movement were somehow the end of revolutionary movements that had not seen what 70s saw as the beginning of all these multiplicities, like coming in and so on and so forth. So we know that at the end of 60s, at least European revolutionary movements were pretty adamant about bringing logic and phenomenology together, like Sartrean phenomenology and like, the structuralism on the other side. And they found a way in Maoist thesis of perpetual practice, or this contradictory unity of theory and practice, as a way of like practice, knowledge, practice, which translated itself into action, 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 constant action, mostly Middle Eastern revolutionary movements at the time in Iran or Iraq and Syria. But later on, as you said, 70s saw the beginning of all these multiplicities, gay movements, feminist movements, black movements, and so on and so forth, which in early 90s swapped its place with thinking with Frankfurt School and things like that, which in our days today, we're seeing it that, oh, when fascists has the bombs out there, which we don't see that bombs as we saw it in the 40s, we have to stick into universities and think without yet coming up with an account of thinking that is capable of not being susceptible to iconic representations of particularities, identity in the sense of these particular local moments in the history of the self that is radically different with the other. My history as Palestinian is different with the history of the land dispute in Mexico, for example, without having this universal political economy underneath. So if that's the context, am I allowed to think of your notion of articulation as a very camouflaged critique of identity politics, or a form of like subsumption of all these particularities into, if I may, a synthetic notion of the unity in multiplicity, multiplicity in unity, without being called Platonic? Can we say that identity politics is the very first impediment towards even going tactically towards that notion of articulation that you're talking about? Thank you.
Well, I don't know, that was quite a fulsome question, so maybe you'd like to respond? Yes.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there. That was great. It's complicated, the history of the concept of identity politics, because I think of, and I'm not totally sure about this, that in the Combahee River Collective statement, which none of us have mentioned, I think of that as actually the first statement of identity politics. I mean, they use the term as thing, but I think, you were saying, is my notion of articulation a camouflage critique of identity politics? And it could be, I'm sort of trying to think along with you, if by identity politics we do understand the, in some ways, irreconcilable particularity of different identities, and not rather, and so as if we had an alternative, either there was absolute autonomy or absolute particularity, or some universal question, and different. If those were the two choices, we'd be fucked. And so I think what I'm thinking through with this process of articulation is the ways that movements, and I'm thinking it maybe more in a practical terms, how movements can find means to struggle together without some assumption of unity or universality, or the like. Like, so for instance, here's just a practical example today that's helpful for me. because this was maybe a gentle critique of a friend of mine to this notion of no priority that I was saying. So it's a friend who's very involved in this movement, Ni Una Menos, and she's from Buenos Aires. So it's a movement that starts as against femicides, against violence against women, and is also a feminist movement. And more generally, it's also a decolonial movement with indigenous populations in Argentina, a worker movement, there's many different things. And so she said, okay, I might agree with you, Michael, about articulation based on there being no priority, but every day there actually are priorities. Like last night, an LGBTQ center was attacked, and so all of us go and defend the LGBTQ center. Or another day, an indigenous woman is attacked, and all of us go do that. So, but that's the kind of practical thing I mean about articulation. So it's not as if the indigenous struggle has to merge itself into the queer struggle. But they can nonetheless, they can remain. Yeah, I'm using relatively autonomous. I'm not sure if that's a helpful or confusing concept here, but they can remain, in some ways, you could see struggles as separate, but not as isolated from one another. I guess finding ways to struggle together. I mean, maybe that's all I'm saying, which sounds more practical that way. And that might get beyond what a certain image of identity politics has become. That's where I'm agreeing with you, and that sounds like a nice way of posing it. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. That's interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for the panel. Thank you, Michael, for your book that I really enjoyed. But one question I had is about the multitude, which is a concept that is strangely silent in your book, especially since obviously that notion has been so central to your work with Tony. And the second question I have, I'm from Argentina. I came of age politically in the 80s. And for us in Latin America, the 80s, it was the decade of revolution in Central America. So I was wondering if you had any comments on the subversive 80s, which are that for Latin Americans, it was indeed still a decade of revolutionary effervescence. Yeah. So thank you.
A, that's a good point. B, I would hate to then do another book about the next. But you're totally right about well, okay. One thing, maybe it's an obvious thing. There's always these periodization arguments, whether they take decades or not, are always in some sense false. And the temporalities are going to be different and in different places. And so the continuations, the extensions through the 1980s that you're referring to seem exactly right to me. I mean, the question about, and I don't have much to say about I would like to have more to say about the struggles against dictatorships in the 1970s, which seems like the appropriate thing to do in that regard. But the beginning of your question is something I needed to respond to, which I can't. Can you just repeat the very beginning? Yes, damn it, yes. Okay, but I mean, in some ways, this is what Tony. So, okay, I'll back up for a minute in case that Tony and I were trying to emphasize, and by developing this concept of multitude, we were trying to emphasize two separate things. One is that the working class, if we understand the working class in the form which I think often in common parlance it still is understood as, which is in some ways centered on at least the industrial workers, had to be understood in a much broader frame. And so multitude for us was a way of understanding class and class struggle in a way that isn't limited to one form of labor among others. I mean, also extending it to non-wage work. Some of this does come from feminist work of the 70s about unwaged domestic work and social reproduction as work and things like that. So one idea of it was trying to expand what was meant by working class and class struggle. You know, but the other thing is in some ways you recognizing the importance of linking class struggle to other struggles of liberation outside of class. And so multitude was our way of trying of a sort of umbrella or rubric for trying to understand that nature of these multiple struggles, you know, within class struggle and class struggle in relation to others. Why I don't, okay, maybe here is, I don't know the reason, the answer to your question, like Michael, why does it not appear in the index of this book? In part because I felt like this concept of multitude, although extremely useful for us, often came to be understood as something spontaneous and not organized. And so, you know, one we became later to talk about it is, what we need to do then is understand, you know, we wanted to propose a movement from class to multitude, like what I was just describing to you, you know, like recognize the plurality. And maybe there needs to be a second movement which moves from multitude to a very different notion of class, which would incorporate all these multiplicities, but emphasize the organization. You know, and so it's that we always understood multitude, when Tony and I were talking to each other, as being an organizational project. But we felt like it's one of those it's one of those things that wasn't understood by readers that way, or often it wasn't. And so maybe that's my hesitation to continue with it when it's understood as a kind of spontaneous, including everybody kind of concept, rather than a political organization project that involves multiplicities. So in some ways, maybe with this notion of articulation that I've been repeating too many times in the last half hour, is a way of trying to explain what we meant by the organizational project of a multitude. That might be a better answer.
I can't believe there are not more questions, but I know you're just mulling over everything that was said.
I'm good with
Give it a
silences.
minute or two.
Oh, there's one
there's
back there,
one,
okay.
yeah.
So thanks so much for that, Michael, and inspiring as always. I want to ask a question which is sort of a devil's advocacy question, though it's another narrative about the 70s. And I'm not sure if I believe it, but it seems to have a certain amount of persuasiveness, which might be, I don't know, might be Piketty or somebody like that's analysis. That what happened in the 70s is also sort of the highlight, the high watermark of the welfare state, right? You still had marginal tax rates in much of Western Europe, 90% or so. You had, I don't know, council house building and so on and so forth. And that perhaps the movements in the early 1970s took all that for granted to some extent and helped to bring that down. Again, the unions, say, in the UK, the miners' strikes and so on, and allowed an opening for a neoliberalism. So that that version would suggest there wasn't just a defeat, it was also a failure of the movements, which again didn't know how good they had it under a welfare state regime, which prevented the kinds of massive disequilibrium and inequalities and so on and so forth, which we've seen the last 40 years or so.
But so John, you're interpreting that the destruction of the welfare state was not so much authored by a neoliberal project, but rather, or maybe made possible, like you could say Reagan and Thatcher were made possible because movements had undermined the basis of that already. Or perhaps similarly with the unions, because it's true that a lot of the most radical revolutionary or worker movements in North America and Europe too had attacked the established unions. And so that maybe you could say that the what you call the generational attack on unions that was then subsequently conducted by the right the ground was laid for it by the attack of radical workers on the established institutional unions themselves. That kind of.
That's sort of what Bruno argues in his article on counter-revolution. You could take a version of that, at least. That's what he's arguing there, too.
Boo. Yeah, I don't know. I'm more confident thinking about the union part of it rather than the welfare state part of it, and so that's what I'm trying to think through. And it could be like, so it could be that. And you could also put some of the parties in this. You could say, for instance, Italian Communist Party was undermined in a way by the extra parliamentary left that created the conditions where the party no longer. It reminds me of that Nancy Fraser argument about feminism being complicit with neoliberalism in some sense. You might be making a kind of heterogenesis of ends argument, like that even though the attacks were meant for greater worker control, they created the conditions where worker empowerment could be completely defeated, something like that. I'm thinking. Let me think through that a little bit. It doesn't sound right to me, but I'm not sure what the right way to argue with it is.
It looks like Alberto wants to.
Please. No, I mean.
Well, I was fumbling. I needed.
No, I find the argument interesting because especially maybe this was more the case a few years ago. I always thought there was a strange, lived but retroactive fantasy, in a way, about the nature of that Fordist or post-war compact and how it's understood, and also, for whom Fordism was and how. Yeah. And I remember this actually at a conference in Spain where this very sharp lecturer in the university who was working on this stuff was telling me about her students. And she said, well, all these students read all the kind of, they read David Harvey on Fordism, and they read all these things. And then they say, when Fordism was, entered into crisis in Spain. And she's like, there was this thing called Francoism. There was no welfare state in Spain to speak of, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, people perceived it, right? Like there was this kind of sense that 45 to 73 is true everywhere and for everyone. And I was thinking about that also in terms of, I think on the one hand, we can think of many of the movements, especially the feminist movements, the critiques of the welfare state, many of the relationships to social reproduction, because that's what the question is about, really, right? Of Black and people of color movements, not just in the US and elsewhere. The situation of migrant and workers in France over this period, like all of these things are areas of struggle, in part because the welfare state is a racialized and selective and disciplinary and et cetera, dimension. But also, and I guess this would be maybe to channel Tony in some way, it would be like the political economic question was that was never going to last anyhow. And the question was, where was that crisis going to go, right? Because certainly in the Italian case, it's not like anybody's imagining that you can maintain the 60s or you can maintain those compacts or here. So I think that vision, it's also Régis Debray's vision of 68 actually, right? 68 was just a kind of, the 68ers, the students were like the useful idiots of capital because they destroyed all of these structures of deference and authority, and then it had its path cleared for it. But that would suggest, which I think any Marxist, but also any, I think, economist or historian would find to be kind of delusional, the notion that this supposedly perfect compact of Fordism could have continued forever. And that, in a sense, is the problem of the 70s, including in the sense of the real conflicts over social reproduction and who and how does it work, right? Like, instead of the fantasy of welfare. Like.
Sharon, did you want to comment?
Well,
Yeah.
No, I wasn't planning to, but I was thinking, because like when I think about like in the U.S. context, the development of, when they say the U.S. was the most socialist during the New Deal, and the way that we talk about it, when I teach is, you can really see two sides of the coin, where it's a democratic socialist state for those enfranchised as citizens, and then a fascist state for those not. And it's both and, not either or. And so, just to echo what Alberto just said, it's broken either way, right? And then under these regimes, it's like you might shuffle who suffers, but someone is always suffering. So, that's kind of the core dilemma. I mean, I feel like it's an akin argument to saying, well, no leftists should run because we don't want Trump in the States, and we don't, But it's like, well, okay, really? Then what options do we have?
I think there's two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up after that. So.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I recently read Communists Like Us, which your comrade Tony and Felix Guattari wrote together. And they sort of started talking about, this is where I first started thinking about the 70s. And they said the revolution continues, and they talked a lot about multiplicity and these kind of things. But they did something interesting, which they talked about what they called the terrorist interlude, I think, if I remember it correctly. And they sort of renounce what they see as this aimless violence by the far left. And whether, we shouldn't even be probably using the term terrorist today, seeing obviously the criminalization of Palestinian resistance and so on. But my question, I guess, it's two questions, but the first one would be, how did Tony's thinking change, maybe over the years, like since they wrote that book in the 80s? And maybe for all the other panelists, how much of a sort of, to what extent should we not be criticizing armed violence, armed struggle in the period of the 70s? Should we not be renouncing that in terms of what methods we're thinking of today for liberation? Thank you.
I got something to say.
Should we take
take another, yes, please.
Should we take both questions?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah? Okay, we made a note of that one. And then can we take this question, and those will be and then we can have your final.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all, panel. So I don't know if there's a question in here, but when I was listening to you, I was taking notes, and some of the notes I would like to comment on, because one of the interesting concepts that you were talking about was liberation and abolitionism. And because you said that today the contemporary belongs to the 70s, so, and I do understand today also as the global social movements, if we can call them, that started in 2010 and that's still continuing last year in Iran. And one thing that is very interesting is that in those moments, in those movements, the moments of liberation and abolitionism and abolishing like gender, class identities in a way were experienced. So they were experienced in the events. And so I'm wondering if they can be organized, if liberation is a concept that is amenable to an organization. So this is partially one. The second is about the failure and defeat. And I wonder if you can contemplate a little bit more on that or maybe comment on it, because defeat, yes, it is an external superior force that is crushing the movements, but because they crush the movements, they're also creating victims out of it. Whereas if we understand failure as a kind of impossibility that the movements in themselves are facing, then maybe we are looking at a different notion rather than a fault, rather than it is something that they should have done, but they haven't in all of those senses, but an impossibility, like a wall that you hit. And finally, I do want to, and we were talking about Steve Biko and that the notion of black is a political concept. I am so happy that you say that. If I call myself a Black person, I would be accused of cultural appropriation. And I don't know if it's only in the context of North America or if this is a little bit more widespread. But I think this partially speaks to what Ali was talking about in the first in his question, because there is a very like a intransigent notion of cultural appropriation, and that we cannot like cross certain boundaries. I cannot call myself Black you cannot call yourself Black. But I mean, there is something different. There was a flow, in a way, in the 1970s when this claim was being made, and that actually allowed the movements to connect with one another, and rather than to remain isolated. But the contemporary discourses, and not all of them are absolutely wrong, but precisely in this, that there's a blockage there. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that. So thank you.
To the first question, and then the panelists can respond, and then you can respond.
Sure. Yeah. That was like super rich, and I'm not sure if even. Okay, but let me start with the first one, because I actually have a precise idea about that. Because I found this was one of those projects where when I started on it, I felt like I had to deal not only with the intensity of repression and study that, but also the clandestine armed groups like the Red Brigades and the Red Army faction and in Germany and Japan, et cetera, because of the spectacular position they held in a certain cultural memory, and even at the time too, and made what was a problem for me is that they seemed to make invisible, eclipse in that sense, what was much more massive movements that I found much more interesting and useful, partly for conducting democratic experiments, et cetera. And so I tried not to at first, and I think that's partly what, and actually the criticism I think that both Tony and Félix Guattari shared in this period. I'm thinking of an essay that Félix Guattari published around the August offensive of the Red Army faction in 1978, I think, where criticizing the movements. Both of them criticized the movements for these clandestine armed movements for their separation from the political developments. Precisely because of their clandestinity, they couldn't be enriched by the kinds of political developments that went on mass movements. So they were not criticized for armed struggle, but for a version of armed struggle that is separate from the movements. But then something that helped me at a certain point when I realized that I think it wasn't a question for the majority of the movements that I'm interested in here between violence and nonviolence. I think that wasn't the problem. That wasn't a question for them. It was rather the ways in which the use of arms was sometimes necessarily attached to the political movements themselves, or wasn't attached to it. So, for instance, it was a kind of antidote for me, or helpful mode of thinking, a variety of movements that functioned on what I think of as a dual strategy, in which there was a armed component, usually in the community self-defense, but also that it in a way allowed for democratic community experiments. I mean, so the obvious one that everyone would know about here is the Black Panther Party, again, where, by the early 1970s, there was a division within the party that was often thematized even with, Huey Newton on one side and Cleaver on the other side, where, of course, the party had a mandate for community self-defense, but at the same time it conducted breakfast programs and free clinics and other communities, so that it was doing both of these at the same time. Autonomia in Italy, I found, had a similar kind of relation. So it wasn't against armed struggle. It was rather about the modes in which, because at least their perception was, and that with the forces, with the nature of the repression, there had to be some sort of methods of self-defense. So anyway, that's I would say the probably poorly explained thing in that book that Guattari and Negri were writing together was, I'm guessing that was part of the critique of that nature of the clandestinity of those armed groups. There's more to say about that, but that's a start of that. Wow, the second one had so many things, and I'm not sure that I'm not really sure, how to answer them. I mean, I could just start with the last one, which it might be useful in our North American context. The ways, because I don't find this question about a political concept of blackness functioning in the U.S. and Canada, but in Britain at the end of the 70s, there was projects for understanding blackness this way. And so that, like a famous strike of South Asian women at a plant, Runwick, yes. And that was considered a black struggle. I mean, so the notion of, there were attempts to develop, let's say, a political concept of blackness in that period in Britain, that would, it would be a good question to know why in the North American context such a conception couldn't function. I mean, like I said, at least in my thinking about it or understandings of things in the US, that third world sometimes function this way, and that, I mean, the discourse on people of color by the end of the 70s and maybe through the 1980s, like even think of The Bridge Called My Back as a representative example of this, had a multiracial project implicit in it, that people of color function that way. But damn, the other things you asked were a lot, and I should stop actually and see if one of the others, because I'm, okay.
No, you didn't want to answer the question about armed violence, armed
No.
I thought you would.
Yeah.
No, I found, I would just reference the book, like the duels, the eclipsing of more democratic project. Like I agreed with Michael's dealing with the 70s and violence. So.
Which also manifests itself in terms of how, I mean, if you read backwards through movements in Italy and elsewhere, through the lens of abolitionism is pretty instructive. The Red Brigades had prigioni del popolo, people's prisons, maybe not, where people's tribunals by revolutionary cells would take place, leading to kneecappings or executions, etc. And there were, and that's I think what becomes unrecognizable, the difference between that and what already in 1980, I mean, he is indeed writing this from prison, in Guerra Comunismo is an explicit prison abolitionist arguments in Tony's part, he says, he has this line in the book, Guerra Comunismo, where he says, no Bastilles will ever be built again if this is really a revolution, right? Like, in fact, that's a criterion of the reality of that liberation. But that becomes radically invisible if violence is not something you can think about, if violence is something that's mute and amorphous, and and if these aren't actual debates, which people did have, right? And so I think it's also, I totally agree with Michael that it wasn't a question about violence or nonviolence, not even about the quantity, so to speak, but it was about the quality and the politics and the fact that it had to be secondary to the notion that you were building something, right? And so that's where the idea of self-defense, which also has this kind of, sui generis Maoist genealogy, right? People talked about red bases, et cetera. So the idea was that, you establish spaces of autonomy such that you will defend them, but you don't enter into the logic, which was an object of internal critique in Italy, of you're an anti-fascist because you've done something that turns the state more fascist than it already was, right? And that, that logic of targeting the state, of provoking the state and then entering into this spiral of repression was, and by the end of the 70s, the only thing that armed struggle movements were doing was trying to break people out of prison and then getting arrested for trying to break people out. That was kind of the dead end and attacking judges and jailers, but it became a bit of a trap. So.
I think we're going to wrap up. Does anyone have any other comments?
No. Well, there are other questions, but maybe we need to.
I think we actually need to wrap up, unfortunately. We can continue afterwards. But I really want to thank you, Michael, for being here with us today and for this wonderful, such a generative, productive conversation we've had with this gift of a book. And I really want to thank Glen, Alberto, and Sharon for your fantastic presentations and reflections on the book. So please join me in thanking the panel.